In this screencast, we're going to talk about the idea of application settings, why you need them, and how to set them up. To give a little motivation, we can think about the fact that in an app, when you're on a certain page, in this case we're in the brewery app, if you're on some page like the list of beers, and you are developing the app, you might actually want some information available on every page. So on this beers page, the data I would have would be from the beer entity, and that's great. But what if on every page I need to know the time zone or the currency being used or some bit of information that is kind of a global piece of information that I want to access? Well, you might think that's not a problem at all. You can just create constants, or you can sort of put this information into the model itself. But sometimes you need to allow the user to edit things, and you don't want to have to rebuild the app each time you change something. And in other cases, if the information itself is some kind of a record in some table somewhere, you might not be able to set it up as a constant. For example, we're going to at some point be talking about sending emails, and to send emails you need these email templates, and the email templates are stored as data in an entity, and therefore if you want to have a certain email template be automatically used at a certain point, it would be harder to hard code. You'd need, and this may not be obvious, but you would need to write some microflow that actually searched the database looking for a particular keyword, and that just is a little bit awkward and a little bit fragile, and if you change your mind later, you have to go find some microflow and change things. So what we'd really like is a bunch of settings that are themselves stored in the data, and which can include things like links to particular records and values and so forth. In order to do that, we're going to use an idea from object-oriented programming called what's called a singleton. We're going to add, and I'm going to show this here, we're going to go to the domain model, and we're going to actually add to the domain model an object called settings. So I will click here and do entity. We're going to make this object, and we're going to call it settings. And you can, once you've created this object, okay, you can add some attributes. So in other screencasts, we'll add some specific attributes, including linking this object to other objects. But right now, let's say we have an attribute called country. And this would be sort of the country that is the app is in. Now, there's no particular reason we would need this in this brewery app, and we'll be using other things, but I want to use a simple example. So let's say you have an app that's going to be used around the world, and each local instance of the app is going to have to say which country it's in. You could add this setting called country, and we click OK. Okay, so the challenge here is we don't want a bunch of different settings. We want one settings record. And when we open the app, we actually need to find that record and make it available throughout the app. So I'm going to show you how that works. The reason it's called a singleton is it's a table that only has one row. And there are going to be some techniques we're going to use to make sure that we only have one row and that it's easy to get that row. And that way, whenever I want settings, I can get this single row and I can look something up. So we're going to be doing that. First, though, a couple of preliminaries that are not about settings so much as a little bit of housekeeping on our app. One thing is settings is going to be something that we're accessing in our own module here. And settings is something that we really think of it as an administrator role. Now, at the moment, if you look at the security in our module, we have a brewer who's able to do some editing of things about the kinds of beers and so forth. We have the guest, who is somebody who isn't logged in yet, and we have the regular user. We could kind of have the brewer serve as an administrator, but if you think about it, some of the things we're talking about here are one-time things, and we'll see this in other screencasts, that a more technical user would set up. And so we may as well go ahead and create an administrative role here, and we will call this admin, and we'll click OK. And now that we've done that, actually we're going to go into security and look at page access, and we're going to want to give the admin access to everything. And notice at this point the brewer also has access to everything, but we'll see as we add some more technical things that maybe only the admin has access. And we'll make sure we don't have any nanoflows. We'll make sure in microflow that the admin has access to everything. The other thing we need to do, now that we've added this, is we need to go back up to the security for the overall project. You see where I clicked. And here, if we look at user roles and we look at the overall role of administrator, and I'm realizing now we could have called the role in our My First Module administrator instead of admin. I'm just going to leave that. That's fine. And now what we're going to do is we want to make sure that the administrator, when we go to edit their roles, their role in the My First Module should not be brewer, it should be admin. They're the admin. So now we have a situation that if someone is logged in as an administrator to the overall app, they have administrator privileges in the brewery part of the app. Okay, so that's one piece of housekeeping. The other piece of housekeeping, so if we go to navigation, we see that we have a couple of things here that are kind of admin type things, and they're sitting at this top level menu. And what we may want to do is actually have an administrator submenu, so that all of, and we're going to accumulate them across various screencasts, all of these special functions can be put right into a submenu, and that way the overall menu for the admin is not too crowded. So I'm going to go to beer guests. I'm going to add a new item here. The item is called admin menu. The icon could be, I think it's cog. Okay, that looks nice and administrative. And this particular menu item does nothing. And then what we can do is we can, and let's see if dragging works. Yes, see how I am dragging the various items here into this menu. So now when we go to add some additional items, they'll be in a nice admin menu. Okay, good. So now that we have our settings, one thing we are going to want to do is we're going to need a way for our admin to edit those settings. So we're going to want to add to the admin menu a new item. By the way, just really quickly, if I wanted to add that from here, I could say new sub item, and that will put it under admin. And we'll call this application settings. And we can give it an icon. It's a pencil. And on click, we're going to need a microflow here. It's going to be a new microflow. Call a microflow. Okay. But we're not quite ready to add that because we're actually, so I'm going to leave this as do nothing. We're actually going to need a page. And the page is going to be a page that edits our settings. So we're going to go to My First Module, right click, add a page. We'll call this update settings. We're going to use the default layout. This is actually going to not be a list. It's going to be a form. We can use the vertical form. And the reason it's a vertical form is because we, rather than being a list, is there's only one setting. And so we don't want a list of setting objects. We want to just open that setting. So we click OK. And now we have this here. And what we want to do is we want to double click. I'm double clicking on the unknown. It's saying what is our data source. That the data source is going to come from a microflow, but it's a microflow that's going to run from the menu. So this thing is not going to run its own microflow. So I put context. That's what I put. What that means is it's not my job on this page to find the data. Someone's going to call this page and give me the data. Okay, so I do select, settings. By the way, the reason I'm using plural, this is a small point, is that I have a single row, but that row has many different settings. So that's why I'm calling it that. So good, we have that. We click OK. Do I want to automatically fill the contents? Yes, I'll go ahead and do that. We only have one thing, it's country. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, how are we going to get to this? So I go to my first module, I right click, I'm adding a microflow. I'll call this update settings. Click OK. And in this microflow, what I need to do, this is going to be something where I'm opening the settings page. So if I go here and I go to Toolbox, when I'm done, what I'm going to do is show a page. It's going to be the thing I do at the end. And the page I'm going to show is going to be this update settings page. Okay. The problem is that update settings needs an object. It needs a settings object. You'll see here if I double click, it says object to pass. I don't have the object. Okay, so I need to find the object. And this is where the singleton idea comes in. This is being run from a menu. I don't have some object already selected. I've got to find it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use a retrieve. So we're going to go look at our settings table. We do retrieve, and we're going to look from the database. We don't have any other context here. We're going right to the database. We are looking in the database at the settings table, and I'm looking for the first record. There should only be one record. So if I find a record, the first one is the one I want. Okay, and if you look here, the name I'll give to this object, this record that I found, is settings. Okay, great. So we found settings. Here, I can now go and say, what object do I want to pass? I want to pass the settings object. Beautiful. But there's a problem. What if this is the first time we're in the database, in this app, and we don't have a settings object? We need to create one. So the problem I have here is if there is no setting, this will return something empty, and I will have a problem. Okay. So what I can do is I can see if it's empty. So I take an exclusive split. All right, I put it right here. You can double click and I said found settings question mark. And the test is $settings is not equal to empty. So I actually was able to get a setting object. And then I can right click here and I can say, hey, if that's true, I'm good, show the page. So what do I do if it's false? So if it's false, I have an activity, and that activity, if I double click, will be to create an object. So I'm going to create a settings object. I'm going to actually commit it. I want to put it right in my database. It's empty, but I know, unlike some other things, that whether the user likes it or not, the admin, we are going to have us a setting object. I don't need to refresh in the client because I don't have a page open. I can click OK. And then once I have a new settings object, I want to go ahead and open up the page. I'm going to pass settings. Oops. New settings, actually, is what I want, because new settings, notice that if I found it, it's settings. If I'm creating one, I need a new variable, new settings. It's a little clunky, but that's how it works. The page I want is the update settings page. Click OK, and now end event. All right, good. So what we have here, and this is a little repetitive, but in my experience, because of how Mendix works, you need these two paths. If I don't find the settings, I create one, I open the page. This means that every time I edit, I'll be able to do this. So now I'm going to do Shift Control S to save all my work. That is File, Save All from the menu. Now I can come back to navigation. And on navigation now, for application settings, what I can do is on click, I'm going to call a microflow. The microflow I'm going to click on is Update Settings. Okay. And now I've done that, but you'll notice I have an error. And the error I have is that this microflow needs to be assigned. This microflow is here in my main modules, so I double click on Security. I go to Microflow Access, Update Settings. We only want to allow the admin to update settings. This is not going to be a brewer thing. Click OK. Now I have no errors. And what I can do is run this app locally. Go ahead and save my changes. Now I need to synchronize the database because I've added the settings object. Ready to view. Okay, I'm going to use the user switcher to choose Demo Administrator. We have the cog. I go up here and I choose Application Settings. And we see this opens up. I can put in the country USA and save it. And now that is saved as a record. So the question is, how would you use this in practice? Okay, so let's come back to our app here, and let's talk about how we might get that information available somewhere else. So typically, when you're grabbing that information, you would be grabbing it in a microflow, okay? And so if we look at a microflow, and this is one where we wouldn't need this, and I'm not going to go too far in here, but remember we have a microflow for playing from another screencast a guessing game, okay? And let's say we wanted to actually have access to, if you look here, we're creating a new guessing game object. Let's say we actually needed to know what country we're in to make some decision about the guessing game. And again, I'm not actually going to do anything with the information like that. I just want to show you how this works. In a subsequent screencast, in particular the screencasts about setting up email sending, you'll see how we grab this information and use it. But right here, I just want to show you how we could do this. So what we would need to do in this workflow, in this microflow, is we would need to go very similar to what we did in the update settings microflow. We would want to retrieve the settings, and then we would want to, get that first record and use it. And if the record was missing, we'd want to create an empty record. Now, an empty record is probably going to cause us some problems. And we would probably want to warn the user that something needs to be done, but we would want to at least get that record. So what we're going to do is, rather than put all that logic here in Start Game, and we'd have to repeat it each time, is we're going to create a new microflow whose job is to find the settings record, to return it, and if necessary, to create a new one and to pop up a message to warn the user that they need to contact the administrator. And then we're going to call that microflow from here and anywhere else we need it. So under my first module, we're going to add a new microflow. The microflow is going to be called Get Settings. Okay. And the microflow, we have this end state here. If I double click, the microflow, ordinarily our microflows have just run and not returned an object. We're going to actually return an object, and that object that gets returned is going to be a settings record with our setting in it. We haven't yet found the record, so we can't actually put that in. So if I click OK, you see we get an error that we haven't put that in. And the other thing is, if we have several branches, they all have to return a settings object. So the logic at this point is going to be very similar to what we already saw. We're going to retrieve from the database, select. We're going to retrieve the settings object, store it in a variable, and actually see where it said setting list. That's a reminder. We want to just get the first one, store it in a variable called settings. Then we've got our test, found settings, question mark. The test is that settings is not equal to empty. If that is true, so we can mark this condition value as true, then you can double click here, and the settings object, we said we want to return one. We have to say which one. It is the one we found in the settings variable. Okay, now what happens if we didn't find settings? What we want to do is we want to add an activity. That activity is to show a message. That message is an error. So the app isn't going to quit, but we want to have a message that's nice and bright and says, hey, application settings have not been initialized. Please contact your system administrator. Please report this problem, I think. Report this problem to your system administrator. Okay, so that's a message we're going to pop up. Blocking means that the message is going to stay there on the screen until the user clicks. Okay, so once the user said, okay, I got it, there's a problem here, we still want we don't want to crash the app. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an activity, and the activity is going to be to create an object. The object we're going to create is a settings object. We're going to commit it. We don't need, I guess, depending on when this is called, we probably don't need to refresh in client because the microflow is going to deal with the settings. Note it's stored as new settings. Okay, and now, end event, we have to return a settings object. In this case, we're returning new settings. Okay, so what do we have? We have this microflow that whenever it's called is going to return a settings object. If there's a problem, it'll alert the user, but it will return a settings object we can access. And now, if we go back to start game and we say, hey, we really needed a settings object, what we can do is add a microflow here. Sorry, not a microflow. We can add a activity, which is a microflow call. Put that there. Double click. And the microflow we want is going to be get settings. And you'll see that that will return this settings information into a variable that here is called settings. So now, if over here somewhere we needed a if in one of these we needed to set something like set the country to the country that's been set somewhere else, we would actually have this settings variable available to us. So again, I'm not going to run this right now because this is more to show you the general approach so that then when we get to other places where we need settings, we'll be ready to use it.